This balance between what you're contributing to the community versus the toll that it's taking on you over the long term, I think is something that needs to be unpacked, particularly as we talked about before. You've got a declining number of people willing to give their time or to enter into that volunteer space.
Welcome to the Research and Reason podcast. Join us as we discuss the latest research, news and opinion from academics in the Faculty of Arts and Education at the University of Auckland.
Kia ora koutou. Ko Julianne Evans tōku ingoa. I'm Julianne Evans, the Media Advisor for the Faculty of Arts and Education, and I'm talking today to Dr. Blake Bennett, a Senior Lecturer on the University's Bachelor of Sport, Health and Physical Education degree, whose expertise ranges from the dynamics of sports coaching to the martial art of kendo and the role of rugby in high school environments. Tēnā koe, Blake. Nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
There's a lot to talk about, but I think we might start with your recent research on volunteer sports coaching, because it involves so many people all around the country who give up their time, during the week and at the weekends, standing around on muddy, fields, making it possible for our young people to actually play sport. But there's a problem, isn't there, that you've discovered in more recent times, that there's loads of people wanting to still do it, but the volunteer part of the equation, they're just not turning up.
Yeah, that's right. There's the most recent data that we can find, or that I can find at the moment, is that there's about 300,000 people in New Zealand that put their efforts into volunteer coaching in particular. But some findings from New Zealand Amateur Sports Association recently found that there's been about a 40% drop in people willing to join up to clubs as coaches in the last 5 years. So we've got a real sort of issue emerging here, not just about retaining volunteers that are currently in, working, doing the muddy field sort of thing and the Tuesday nights and all that sort of stuff, but also getting people to stay, getting people in. Those are the challenges that are starting to emerge now.
And why do you think that is? You mentioned sort of after COVID in particular, things falling away. What do you attribute it to?
Yeah, obviously more research is needed to really find out, but I think that an educated guess, and anybody who has done volunteering would be able to attest to this. There's changes in how we prefer to spend our free time. A bit of a redress on work-life balance, and that sort of spills over into how I want to spend my free time when I'm not at work, when I'm not spending time with family or other commitments. And then, of course, there's other things like the cost of living, having to prioritise other things in our lives as well. So, as always, there's more research that's required. But those are the sorts of things that I think initially influence people's decisions on whether I'm going to pick up this role, if I've been asked or if I should volunteer my time to volunteer. So these things are starting to emerge, but as I say, more research is needed. And
what about the people who are doing it still? What are they facing then because of the fact that, there are fewer of them?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to keep in mind, because if we are seeing a decrease in people wanting to volunteer, that leaves those who are still, at the coalface,
doing hard work.
Yeah, picking up a significant amount of extra work. So it's really important to sort of consider what those people are going through, I think. And my research in this space at the moment, I've talked to a number of coaches in this space volunteering their time, and sort of labelled them lifers in many ways, because despite the challenges that they might be facing with regards to, more expectations and less resources, they're still hanging on. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where it becomes really interesting, because there's a lot of research out there about how to recruit, how to retain, and understanding about the challenges that volunteer coaches face.
And these are people who don't get paid at all, or who get paid a little bit maybe?
Yeah,
or
I think
get recompensed for some of their time?
Yeah, there's often a case between the coach and the club that there'll be some sort of payment in kind or some sort of acknowledgement of that, but often that's not the case either.
And these are men and women across all sports. We're talking about cricket, rugby, netball.
Right. That's right. And in particular when you've got, that in that club space where you've got, competition for people to come on board, to join those clubs. And I think, to answer your question before, I think, these volunteers who are grinding away at the work, without the support coming in, new support coming in, there's a real issue, I think, emerging from, at least from my data, that they're being pinned down with what I'm calling compliance fatigue, trying to keep up with all of the documentation, the policies, the impact of those policies, and making best guesses rather than best practice. At the end of the day, they're volunteers. They have expertise in what they do, but not necessarily in the space of, for example, meeting the obligations of the Incorporated Societies Act, or
that sounds very formal.
Well, and that's precisely it. You've got volunteer organisations held up by goodwill and wanting to contribute and being part of something bigger than yourself. But at the same time, there's this increasing almost professionalisation or corporatisation of these volunteer organisations. And it makes sense in many ways.
It's a health and safety thing.
There's health and safety. There's perhaps concerns around the management of funds within these organisations. So, to tighten up in a policy space is an important thing. But I think what's equally important is we don't lose sight of the impact that this has on the people who aren't experts in this space, and they are only, for the most part, contributing their time in the best way they know how.
Because they love it.
Because they love it, because they love the sport, because they want to contribute, or they feel obliged to, or whatever the rationale might be. But for me, the research that I'm doing is starting to show that those that endure, even though we've got a decline of people coming on board, those that endure, those lifers, the concern that I'm starting to see is what impact is this having on well-being, the individual's well-being. There's a little bit of fear, I guess, in stepping back, even when it does get a bit tough, and it is stressful. Many volunteers will sort of sit back and think, wow, if I was to leave it now, has everything I've built is it going to
crumble away?
Is it going to collapse?
And they believe in it so much. Very often it's in fact sometimes more important than their actual day jobs, isn't it? It becomes a thing, it's their passion.
Yeah, it's totally built around passion. And, you jump into the psychological literature to sort of explain it, in terms of intrinsic motivation. People feel connected to the group, they feel aligned to the values of that organisation, or, they've been involved for a really long time, and
they played the sport themselves, probably.
Highly likely as well. And so, and you get this sort of this complex situation where people's identity are wrapped up in this club or in this organisation, and even though it's really hurting me, I can't walk away because these people mean too much to me. The value of what I'm doing is still there, I'm sure. And so this balance between what you're contributing to the community versus the toll that it's taking on you over the long term, I think is something that needs to be unpacked, particularly as we talked about before. You've got a declining number of people willing to give their time or to enter into that volunteer space.
And these are not just parents of children playing the sport, are they? Well, are they?
No, well, I think we probably all know one or two people that are coaching a football team this season because their son or daughter is involved in it, and I think that's staple in Kiwi culture, right? But again, there are people that have been there for a really long time that, as you said, maybe played the sport in the past or currently still playing it, or maybe they started because little Billy or little Janie was playing.
But they've long since grown up.
They've
Yeah.
long since grown
Yeah.
up, but there's still a need, and we
Yeah.
see this opportunity to contribute to something bigger than ourselves, right?
The safeguarding of children in that environment, I know you've done a bit of research on, and it's a very sticky kind of topic that's difficult across the board, really. And we don't, and when you get it wrong, the consequences are so high for inappropriate behaviour between adults and children. Explain a bit about that impact on these volunteers.
Yeah. This is, you're right. It's a really interesting one because as I mentioned before, you've got, the importance of these sorts of policies can't be understated. And most of us would not argue with the fact that there needs to be some good, solid child safeguarding policy in place in places like sport. But it's, like all areas worthy of research and deeper investigation, it's not that easy. It's not that simple. Because when you put those sorts of expectations, policy-based expectations on a volunteer, it can often lead to an anxiety that I'm interpreting this wrong, I'm going to do this wrong.
Paralysis.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what I found in my research.
Is this the 2014 Children's Act that we're talking about?
Yes, that's
yeah.
right.
So what does that stipulate for those who might not know?
Yeah, so the Children's Act was introduced to make sure that the people working with children across all areas, be it in education or sport or healthcare or whatever, met certain criteria in terms of their background, where they've come from,
police checks
and those sorts of things. So, really important stuff. Because one is too many, one case is too many. So I don't think, as I said, anybody would disagree with the need to have policy around looking after children in the context of sport. But again, the problem is that these are volunteers interpreting or making sense of these policies. And oftentimes, or at least in the context of sport, it can be a little bit grey because the original Act sort of suggests that this is for people who are working with children, but not necessarily in the volunteer context, right? And so it ends up becoming something that clubs or organisations themselves need to navigate, and that becomes really, really difficult to do, as you said, because you get guessing at best guess rather than best practice.
How old are children in that context? When do they become an adult from the point of view of that law?
Yeah, I'd stand to be corrected on this, but I can't remember if it's 16 or 18. I can't actually remember.
It would cover most of the children who are currently playing sport, in an environment that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that the policy is intended to capture, any sort of situation where there are young people engaged with adults or vice versa, adults working with young people, in my case, in the context of sport clubs.
Does it restrict men in particular? Because I'm just assuming that it might apply to them more in some ways, male coaches and female and male children. I don't know.
Yeah, sure. So my interpretation or my reading of the Act, that's not the case.
No.
But what was interesting in the research that I did in this area is that that's precisely the interpretations that are being made. So there were instances where coaches and organisational leaders were making the call that there wouldn't be any coaching across those gendered lines. So you wouldn't have a male coach working with female athletes. And I think that that's an indication of where things get a little bit sideways from what the intention is. There's a lot of implications for saying that we won't have our male coaches working with our female athletes. If you think more broadly about the benefit of that experience, or even if it comes down to a basic human resources sort of a thing, we don't have that many coaches. Most of our coaches in this organisation are male. But
what are they going to do?
What are we going to do? And, other assumptions that were coming through in my research that were interesting were real along the lines of no-touch policies, right? Blanket no-touch policies. And they're not in the law necessarily, right? But again, it's an interpretation of what we should be doing to keep, first of all, the children safe, but also
The volunteer
the
coaches.
volunteer coaches as well. And so when you say no touch,
What does that mean, really?
Well,
does that sort of eliminate a pat on the back? Gosh, you've done really well. Good on you. Or,
yeah,
the sort of natural stuff, isn't it?
that's right.
Yeah.
And there's enormous benefit in that context when you've got adults working with young people to build solid human connection.
Trust.
That's right.
And good role modelling too.
That's right.
Yeah.
And touch plays a part in that. So like you say, if it's a pat on the back or a high five, you think, well,
What's wrong with that?
What's wrong with that? But when you're talking with the volunteers trying to do their best and interpret what's required of them,
They're not doing that. They're afraid.
they often make assumptions about what the best thing to do is, and the easiest thing is to say, look, just don't touch, nobody touch anybody. That'll do it, right? But there's research that inspired me to take this on in a New Zealand context, in particular out of the UK. And when they went through a similar thing, a couple of years ago, or more than that, but 10 or so years ago, they started to see this culture of suspicion sort of arising between colleagues, parents and coaches, and that has a really tangible impact on people when they're operating, often as we're talking about, in the volunteer context, to have that sort of suspicion, at least to feel it or to project.
It's a horrible thing, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it could be very serious for your whole life.
The allegation is a scary thing to be confronted with, right? And I think that makes perfect sense for somebody to go, you know what?
No, it's too hard. I'm not doing it.
I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to
Walk away,
or
and everybody misses out, really.
I think at the end of the day, that's right. And the people that endure, as we're saying, they're the ones that continue to try and do the right thing, find the balance, and then they end up potentially over the long term really suffering, often in silence as well, because there's this assumption that the work that I'm doing or that that person is doing is absolutely critical and it must be maintained and sustained. And the moment that I step away, it's all going to fall apart, and I think that's what keeps people in, but it's also what keeps people struggling as well. So it's a really sort of complicated issue.
Really complex human psychology and feeling sense of worth and value and also having a huge gap in your life when you do step away.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and you're absolutely right, because there's this sense of identity that's wrapped up in it as well. And interesting, the word obligation comes up a lot in the data that I'm looking through. When you ask people, why are you still doing this? If this is really
exhausting you,
and impacting your well-being, why do you persist? And as I say, this idea of my identity is wrapped up in this, and the obligation that I have not only to the or not even necessarily to the organisation, but to the people around you and the people that you've worked with. Because at the end of the day, this is about connection. What drives people is connection to other people. We're social creatures in that way, right?
And you've had experience of this yourself. You're a coach yourself in kendo, which is a Japanese martial art.
It is.
And probably not that well known, I would say, in New Zealand in particular.
It is not.
No. So now's your moment to talk a bit about kendo and the fact that you are working as a volunteer in a high-performance context because you're coaching the New Zealand kendo team en route to the World Champs in Tokyo in 2027.
That's right.
So how do you navigate these challenges that you're talking about in your own research in your life?
Yeah, sure. Well, from the outset, I'm a lifer. I am one of these people that, I think, if I'm honest, and what a place to do that on a podcast, but I struggle. I really, really struggle because this is a high performance environment that I'm trying to build and maintain. But it's done in absence of any financial resource and very limited human resources as well.
Can you explain what kendo is, just for those who don't know?
Yeah, sure. It's probably a good place to start. So kendo is the best analogy that I can draw is to that of Star Wars. So I understand that that Star Wars was heavily influenced by kendo fighting and those sorts of things. It was guided by a kendo master. So the image in listeners' heads would probably be best located in what you see on a Star Wars flick. But essentially, it stems from samurai culture, Japanese warrior culture. It was evolved over time. We keep losing limbs every time we practice with the swords, so why don't we think of something that's a little bit safer to use? So you use big heavy armor, bamboo swords or bamboo slats roped together with leather.
Oh my gosh!
To double as swords. So it's a interesting way to spend your Saturday mornings for sure.
And you are combating with another person.
That's right. So
using those bamboo type swords.
Exactly. Yeah. So you've got 4 targets on your body: one on the head, one on the wrist, one on the torso, and a thrust to the throat. And while you're trying to hit the other person, they're trying to evade you and counter and those sorts of things. So it's a one-on-one sport. I'll probably get strung up for saying that it's a sport because people like to think about it more as a martial art because it has different connotations, but for all intents and purposes, it's a physical activity where there's a strong competitive element. And as you said, we're heading off to the World Champs in Tokyo in May 2027.
And you've got a team of people doing that with you?
We're currently going through the selection process and building up the New Zealand Kendo Wolves in their preparation for this high-performance event. So there's about 55 countries that participate in the World Championships.
And we're going to be one of them for the first time?
No, not at all. No, we've been attending the World Champs since the early 80s. Every 3 years, we've fielded a team. So New Zealand's best result in history has been top 8, and we're aiming for the same thing coming up in 2027. Yeah.
Who are you coaching, Blake? Are you coaching boys and girls, and what sort of ages are they, and how do you navigate some of those things you've been talking about?
Yeah, sure. So it's I'm the head coach, so I oversee the entire group. We have a men's coach and a women's coach, and a men's squad and a women's squad. I think the youngest that we have in the squad at the moment is around about 16, and we have some exceptional talent in that younger age bracket, and then older members would go all the way up to the early 40s, I think. So we've got quite a range. Kendo's not defined by weight class or age class. You just get stuck in. If you're good enough to make the national team, then you can, you're on the floor. So that's the context. In terms of the challenges, I mean, I really resonate with the data that's coming through about the compliance fatigue and role bleed, so joining up to be the coach, but all of a sudden you're having to make sense of, child safeguarding if it applies, or incorporated societies, whatever it means, in the context of high performance. There's always going to be policies and organisational things that you have to navigate, and all of these things become learning experiences,
but very time consuming, I'd imagine.
But that's the point, is that you're trying to coach, you're trying to manage all number of other things. But I think the key learning for me from this experience is the need to extend grace to the people that you're working with, right? And they're volunteers doing their best, and sometimes they make a mistake, sometimes they don't do what they said that they were going to do.
So give them a break.
And that's the thing. And you can go into a high performance and you say, right, this is the way it's going to be, and these are the rules, and this is what we're going to do, and this is our values, and all these sorts of things. But at the end of the day, the people that are coming with you have got other things going on, and it's not necessarily their number one. In many cases, it is, because people are really passionate about representing their country. But we all have to navigate the other things that are going on, whether it be family or work or other time commitments. So to have that attitude of, or that stance of forgiveness in the first place, and say, look, I get it, and I'll be patient, wait, has been a really big learning curve for me as well. But I think a really important one, because you sort of dial it back and you think, well, what are the priorities here? Yes, it's important to do well at the World Champs. Everybody wants that. But it's a long journey, and if we look at it from 30,000 feet, those little bumps, those little mistakes that we encounter along the way, they're not going to make a big difference. And if we're kind to each other in that process, I think that's probably what matters the most for me right now.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use that word kind because I think coaches sometimes, especially, in films and things, have a reputation for not being very kind, for, drop down and give me 10 kind of, that they're sort of tough and they take a tough stance, and that's apparently something that gets results. We haven't talked about that, but I'm hearing from you that might not be the way to coach people.
It's a constant battle I have with the students that I teach here, and working through those assumptions about what an effective
Because you're
coach would be.
teaching students to be coaches, are you?
That's right. Part of my contract here at the university is to work in the Bachelor of Sport Health and PE, and so I lead the coaching
part of that.
Coaching.
And do you have a
papers.
lot of people keen to do it?
Increasingly so, increasingly so, which is really encouraging. But of course, when people come through, there are assumptions based on what they've seen, what they've been through, what they've seen on the movies, as you say, and what makes an effective coach. And oftentimes, it's a conversation of we don't coach sport, we coach people, right? Which is it's a nice way to sort of redress the assumptions and sort of ground yourself in a little bit of a different philosophy. How are these people in this context going to respond best? And it might not be from making them do laps, if they're late to training or something like that. There's got to be a little bit more compassion, particularly when you're talking about people who are not professional athletes. In the case of kendo, for example, they're not even amateur. They're hobbyist, right? They're doing it because they love it, and they're punching very, very high to represent their country. And so, in order to go to the world champs, they need to work. They need to go to work, and take an extra shift. So that's an example of where that flexibility, that understanding, that kindness needs to come through. And I think
is that what you're saying to your students?
As much as possible, and where it's relevant. When we're at the university, there's a really, a nice, tidy little context where the students turn up at a given time and they participate as part of their studies. And so it's everything works really smoothly most of the time. In the real life in the community, that's not necessarily the case. So it's a balance between expectations. These are the expectations that I have of you as a coach, and I think that's really, really important. But at the same time, as long as we can keep communication lines open, I'm flexible and I understand that this is not your number one necessarily, and you need to prioritize other things. So, there's again complicated, not necessarily straightforward. Coach tells you what to do all the time and you do it and then you perform well. There's lots of moving parts because we coach people first of all.
And in lots of different contexts and lots of different sports, I suppose.
That's right, and that's a huge part of it. If you're working with young ones, the 10-year-olds, for example, is doing laps and running through the cones and really fine tuning how they trap the ball and kick the ball and obviously, the fundamentals are really important, but what's the experience? Is the experience...
Are they going to have fun? Are they going to want to come back?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important thing for a community coach to keep in mind is how do I structure my trainings in a way that's enjoyable to keep them coming back? Because there's other research that tells us that these efforts to introduce a high-performance culture for young people it has no real correlation to high performance when they become adults, right? So the experience needs to be arguably far more centered around fun and enjoyment and engagement and making them keen to come back, even if it's not the same sport. Just the fact, I loved that coach. He or she was so amazing and really wants me to, it really encourages me to get stuck in next season. And those are the challenges in addition to all the other things that coaches have. How can I, this is how I was coached, but I know that that's not that fun.
No, that's right. Or at PE, at school.
That's right.
And also just managing the expectations of parents who want their little, child to sort of do better than everyone else and maybe be in the top team and those kinds of things.
That's right. The parental expectations are also a big part of it. And, talking to a lot of my coaching buddies, we all tend to agree that if you're teaching young people or coaching young people, you've got parents as an additional member to that team, right? And you need to bring them on.
For better or worse.
Yeah, and it's in our best interest to bring them along with you, you know?
That's right.
Yeah.
Look, I wish you all the best with your kendo trip. I hope it all happens for you, and thank you so much for coming to talk today.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Research and Reason podcast. Stay up to date with the Faculty of Arts and Education by following us on social media.